Imagine the sensory overload of the old market square in Rouen on a late May morning in 1431. The air would have been thick with the smell of sulfur and the murmur of a restless crowd, held back by 800 English soldiers. In the center of this grim theater stood a scaffold built unusually high, a deliberate architectural choice. At the top of this pyre stood a 19-year-old girl, her head shaved, wearing a paper hat that screamed her crimes to the world. This young woman was Joan of Arc, and her destruction was the single most important political objective of the English occupation of France. To understand why a teenage peasant was subjected to the most expensive and elaborate legal proceeding of the Middle Ages, we must understand the machinery that placed her there. The trial of Joan of Arc was never truly about theology. It was about the survival of the English claim to the French throne. The Hundred Years' War was a dynastic struggle where political legitimacy was inextricably linked to divine favor. The English argument was that God supported the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited the French Dauphin, Charles VII, and acknowledged Henry VI of England as the true King of France. When Joan emerged from the Lorraine borders and successfully led Charles to his coronation at Reims, she shattered the English propaganda that God was on their side. If Joan was truly a divinely ordained messenger from heaven, then the English were fighting against God himself. Therefore, for the English occupation to endure, Joan couldn't simply be slain as a soldier. She had to be discredited as a witch and a heretic. It was imperative to prove that her victories were the work of demons, thereby revealing Charles VII as a king who owed his crown to the forces of hell. This political necessity drove the English to purchase this peasant for a sum typically reserved for capturing a king. Notably, the French king, despite being placed on the throne with the help of Joan, didn't join the bidding, a decision that has raised questions for over 600 years. The road to the stake began with a moment of chaos outside the walls of Compiègne in May 1430. Joan had rushed to the town to assist in its defense against the Burgundians, the French allies of the English. During a skirmish, she and her company were cut off from the safety of the town. As they retreated toward the bridge, the governor of the city ordered the gates closed and the drawbridge raised. Whether this was a cold military calculation to save the city or a calculated betrayal remains a subject of historical debate. Whatever the case, the result was that Joan was left trapped on the wrong side of the moat. She was pulled from her horse by an archer who grabbed the lavish cloth of gold coat she wore over her armor. She wasn't taken by the English initially, but by the Burgundians, who held her for months while the negotiations took place. Once transferred to English custody in Rouen, Joan faced a legal proceeding that was rigged from its inception. The trial was orchestrated by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a brilliant but ambitious cleric who had tied his career to the English cause. The venue itself was a violation of ecclesiastical law. As a woman accused of heresy, Joan should have been held in a church prison, guarded by nuns who could protect her virtue. Instead, she was thrown into a dark cell in the tower of the castle of Rouen, shackled in irons, and guarded day and night by 5 English soldiers of the lowest rank. These men subjected her to constant mockery and the terrifying threat of the most disturbing forms of violence. This environment was designed to break her spirit before she even entered the courtroom. Furthermore, the trial lacked a defense attorney, and Joan stood alone against dozens of the most learned theologians and lawyers in Europe. To ensure they had enough material to condemn her, Cauchon employed insidious tactics, including the use of a spy named Nicolas Loiseleur. He posed as a fellow prisoner and a sympathetic countryman from Joan's home region, sometimes even disguising himself as a shoemaker to gain her confidence. He would hear her confession in her cell, while English notaries listened from a hidden location, scribbling down her private thoughts to be used against her in the public sessions. This entrapment underscores the desperation of the judges to find a theological error in the words of an illiterate girl who had effectively checkmated their initial investigations. The public interrogations were a spectacle of theological combat. The judges tried repeatedly to trap Joan into admitting something that would contradict church doctrine. They asked her about the nature of her voices, trying to prove they were demonic. They asked if St. Michael was unclothed when he appeared, to which she sharply retorted by asking if they thought God couldn't afford robes for his angels. They interrogated her about the specific dialect her voices spoke, and she replied that they spoke better French than the judges did, a biting insult to their pro-English leanings. But the most dangerous moment came when they asked her if she knew herself to be in the grace of God. This was a masterstroke of a trap. If she answered yes, she would be committing the sin of presumption, as no human can know for absolute certain they're saved. If she answered no, she would be confessing to being in a state of sin, which would instantly discredit her claims of divine guidance. Joan's answer to this impossible question is one of the most famous responses in legal history. She replied that if she wasn't in God's grace, she prayed he would put her there, and if she was, she prayed he would keep her there. The transcript shows that the judges were stunned into silence. She had navigated a theological minefield with a simplicity that baffled the doctors of the Sorbonne. They couldn't understand how an uneducated peasant girl from a rural backwater could have such an advanced understanding of theology. Frustrated by her surprising agility on spiritual matters, the court turned to physical evidence, specifically her insistence on wearing male clothing. They built a case that her dress was an abomination against Scripture, ignoring her practical explanations that these were a defense against the male soldiers guarding her. Realizing that the initial 70 articles of accusation were too broad and difficult to prove, the prosecution distilled the charges down to 12 essential points. These articles were a distortion of her testimony, stripping away the context of her answers to present her as a stubborn heretic who refused to submit to the authority of the church. They focused heavily on her refusal to deny her voices and her wearing of male attire. These 12 articles were sent to the University of Paris, the theological authority of the realm, which promptly returned a verdict of guilty. The academic elite of Christendom had colluded to condemn a peasant who could not read her own indictment. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy. On May 24, 1431, Joan was taken to the cemetery of the Abbey of Saint-Ouen for a public sermon. The executioner was present with his cart, and the pyre was waiting. The pressure on her was immense. A preacher railed against her and her king, calling Charles VII a heretic who was attempting to establish his own church. In a moment of fiery loyalty, Joan interrupted the sermon to defend the king who had abandoned her, declaring him the noblest of all Christians. But as the sentence was read, Joan's resolve faltered. Facing the immediate terror of the fire, she agreed to submit to the church. This moment is in controversy. Witnesses later testified that the document read to her was a short note, in which she promised not to bear arms or wear male clothes. However, the official record contains a long, detailed confession of crimes, something that the illiterate peasant couldn't have possibly had explained to her in that time. It was a classic bait-and-switch operation, where she signed one thing, but was held accountable for another. She signed with a circle or a cross, which some historians interpret as a sign of derision or a signal that the signature was made under duress. Pierre Cochon accepted her recantation, and she was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. The English were furious, believing the bishop had let her slip through their fingers, but he reportedly reassured them that they would catch her eventually. The reprieve lasted only a few days. Joan was returned to the same English prison, to the same guards, and crucially, she was forced to wear a dress. On the morning of May 27th, she was found wearing male clothing again. The official story from the judges was that she had obstinately returned to her sin. The reality, testified to by court officials years later, was far more sinister. Some accounts suggest that her guards had physically stripped her of her dress and thrown the male clothing into her cell, leaving her no choice but to put them on. When the bishop arrived to question her, he found her not only in male dress, but also spiritually defiant. She retracted her confession, stating that she had betrayed her truth out of fear of the fire. She declared that her voices had returned and rebuked her for her weakness. This was exactly what the bishop needed. By retracting her confession and resuming the forbidden clothing, she became a relapsed heretic. Under the rules of the Inquisition, a heretic who relapsed couldn't be saved from the fires. The trap had sprung shut. The execution on May 30th was designed to be the ultimate spectacle of annihilation. Joan was allowed to receive communion, a strange irregularity for a condemned heretic that suggests even her judges were highly uneasy about the sentence. This makes sense, as everyone who interacted with this teenage peasant girl was in awe of her spiritual authority. The crowd was immense, and the mood was heavy with a mix of bloodlust and pity. As she was chained to the stake, she asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by a sudden impulse of compassion, broke a stick in two and lashed it together to form a crude cross, which she kissed and placed against her body. She also begged a friar to hold a church crucifix high before her face so that she could see it through the flames. When the fire was lit, the agony was horrific, yet the records indicate she didn't scream curses or pleas for mercy. Instead, she shouted the name of Jesus repeatedly until the end. The impact on the witnesses was profound. Onlookers who had previously been there for the quote-unquote entertainment of this public spectacle started to impulsively cry. Even representatives of the English crown were seen weeping, with one lamenting that they were all lost because they had burned a true saint. Her remains were then burned to ash and thrown into the Seine River to ensure that no relic would be left for the faithful to venerate. The trial of Joan of Arc stands as a chilling testament to the way law can be weaponized by power. The English and their Burgundian allies believed that by burning the body, they could eliminate her ideas and her spirit. They were wrong. The flames at Rouen didn't purify the English cause at all. Rather, in this act, they turned her into the ultimate martyr for the French cause. Historians have speculated that Charles VII and his advisors may have desired this outcome, believing that Joan the Martyr would turn their cause into a holy conflict. 25 years later, after the French had reclaimed Rouen, a rehabilitation trial was held. It exposed the corruption, the intimidation, and the procedural illegalities of the original verdict. The 1431 judgment was declared null and void, ripped out of the archives and symbolically destroyed. In the end, the trial designed to destroy Joan of Arc became the very vehicle that preserved her words and her spirit for eternity. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members who are interested in history. This is the best way you can help my channel grow if you appreciate my work. Also, don't forget to check out Lazy Chill History on Spotify and give a follow and rating over there as well. The execution was proceeding with the grim, rhythmic efficiency that characterized the violent justice of the Viking Age. Yet the prisoners awaiting their turn on the log displayed none of the terror one might expect from men facing their final moments. These weren't ordinary captives, trembling in the face of oblivion. They were Jomsvikings, members of a legendary mercenary brotherhood that had terrorized the Baltic Sea. They had a reputation to uphold that was far more valuable to them than their mere biological existence. On a beach in Norway, following a crushing naval defeat that had shattered their fleet, the survivors were lined up to be beheaded by a warrior named Thorkel the Clay. The atmosphere was less that of a slaughter and more of a macabre theater performance, where each warrior sought to outdo the last in displays of nonchalant bravery and gallows humor. One man quipped that he would hold his cloak to catch his blood, lest it stain his fine clothes, treating his death as a minor inconvenience to his laundry. Another asked the executioner to strike him in the face so he could see death coming, promising not to blink as the steel bit into his flesh. But it was a young man with long golden hair, described in the text as being as silky as a woman's, who would truly immortalize the spirit of the order and the scene itself. As his turn came to kneel on the blood-soaked log, he didn't beg for mercy or pray to the gods. Instead, he made a practical, almost vain request. He asked that someone hold his hair back so the axe would not soil his beautiful locks. A thrall stepped forward, wrapping his hands tightly around the prisoner's hair to pull it taut. The executioner raised his axe high. At the precise moment the blade whistled down, the Jomsviking jerked his head violently downward. The axe didn't hit the neck as intended. Instead, it cleaved through the thrall's wrists, severing his hands completely. As the bloody stumps fell away and the thrall screamed in agony, the warrior looked up with a detached amusement. In a scene that sounds like something out of Game of Thrones, he asked the gathered crowd why a man had his hands stuck in his hair before he defiantly received his final blow. This visceral story, preserved in the Jomsviking saga and Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, serves to illustrate the reputation of these legendary soldiers. But we must ask ourselves, who were these men really, and did they really exist? Were they, as the sagas suggest, an elite order of warrior monks living in a fortress called Jomsborg, bound by a strict code of conduct? Or were they merely a literary invention, a romanticized memory of the pirate garrisons that dotted the Baltic coast? To answer these questions, we must peel back layers of myth, archaeology, and historiography, traveling to the windy shores of Volyn in modern-day Poland to sift through the truth. The story begins with a man named Palnatoke, a figure of immense stature and complexity in Norse legend. He was a Danish chieftain from the island of Finn, who chafed under the rule of kings and valued his independence above all else. The Jomsviking saga credits him with the foundation of the Brotherhood, painting him as the architect of its laws and the builder of its fortress. His relationship with the Danish royal family was fraught with tension, as he was the foster father of Sweyn Forkbeard, the son of King Harald Bluetooth. The sagas suggest that Palnatoke encouraged Sweyn to rebel against his father, fueling a generational conflict that would tear Denmark apart. However, it was Palnatoke's own conflict with Harald that led to his exile and the subsequent creation of the Order. Having become an enemy of the crown, Palnatoke took to the sea, sailing east to the coast of Wendland, the land of the Slavic Wends along the southern Baltic shore. It was here that he encountered a ruler named Burislav. In the saga, Burislav is a pragmatic ruler plagued by Viking raids who needs a solution. Recognizing Palnatoke's martial prowess, he makes the Dane an offer. He will grant him a territory at the mouth of the Oder River. In return, Palnatoke would defend this Slavic kingdom from other Viking raiders from their fortress at Jomsborg. The saga's description of Jomsborg is nothing short of majestic, bordering on the fantastical in its scale and engineering. It describes a massive fortification with a stone wall facing the sea, a rarity in the wooden world of the north. The most distinct feature was its harbor, which wasn't a natural bay where ships were beached, but an artificial harbor enclosed by the fortress walls. We are told that this harbor was vast enough to accommodate 300 longships, implying a military-industrial complex of staggering scale. What truly separated the Jomsvikings from a standard chieftain's retinue or a pirate crew was their law. These laws had the effect of making the men professional soldiers in service of the most pure ideals of the Norse gods. The first rule was the age limit, which dictated that no man older than 50 and no boy younger than 18 was allowed to join. The second rule strikes at the heart of Viking social structure by nullifying kinship. In the outside Norse world, if a man slew your brother, you were honor-bound to seek revenge or demand blood money. But inside Jomsborg, family feuds were forbidden. A new recruit had to agree that any feuds they had with anyone were left at the gate. The third rule was the most famous. Fear was forbidden. A Jomsviking was not permitted to flee, regardless of the odds. The fourth rule concerned women, stating that no women were allowed within the fortress walls. The men slept in barracks, not in family farmhouses, emphasizing the monastic, segregated nature of the order. They were married to combat, not to women. Finally, all plunder was to be split equally, regardless of rank, and anyone who broke this rule faced cold steel. Notably, unlike other Vikings, who maintained an agricultural lifestyle when they weren't out raiding, these men were full-time soldiers who didn't keep farms. The first great test of the Jomsviking order came about through a drunken vow. At a feast honoring the death of one of their leaders, King Swine Forkbeard manipulated the Jomsvikings into making reckless promises. As the ale horns were passed around, the king vowed to launch the most ambitious invasion of England in generations. He promised that his men would receive wealth beyond their wildest imagination for participating in this assault on the island. This declaration was, in essence, a clever trick, because it was seen as a direct challenge to the honor and courage of the great mercenary company in his midst. Not to be outdone, a Jomsviking leader stood up and vowed to drive Jarl Hakon, the ruler of Norway, from his lands. The Jomsviking fleet sailed north around the year 986, eventually meeting the Norwegian levy fleet at Hjörungavágr. The battle began well for the Jomsvikings, whose discipline and heavy armor gave them the advantage. But the saga introduces a supernatural element to explain their eventual defeat. Jarl Hakon, seeing the battle turning against him, retreated to an island and knelt in prayer to his patron goddess, Thorgerd Holgabrud. When prayer wasn't enough, he offered the ultimate sacrifice, and she demanded his son, to which Hakon agreed. The goddess accepted this grim trade, and the sky darkened as a horrific hailstorm erupted, beating into the faces of the legendary fighters. A battle ensued, with many Jomsvikings breaking their code against fear and surrender, leading to that infamous execution scene on the beach. The final act of the Jomsviking drama played out on the green fields of England. In 1009, a massive Viking army arrived on the English coast, led by Thorkel the Tall. They ravaged southern England, but the discipline of the army began to fracture. In 1012, after capturing Archbishop Alfeg of Canterbury, the Vikings demanded a ransom. When Alfeg refused to pay, the drunken warriors pelted him with the skulls of cattle and stones before slaughtering him with an axe. Thorkel the Tall, disgusted by the unruly mob violence of his own men, defected to the English king, Ethelred the Unready. This stunning turn of events suggests that for Thorkel, the Jomsviking ideal of disciplined warfare was more important than loyalty. For centuries, Jomsborg was considered a myth, a Nordic Atlantis, but modern archaeology has begun to close the net around the truth. The primary candidate is the town of Wolin in Poland. Medieval chronicles mention a wealthy city in this location called Jumna. Further, excavations have revealed a major trading emporium with Scandinavian weapons and jewelry. Recent discoveries have revealed massive wood and earth ramparts dating to the 10th century on a hill nearby. If Volin was the commercial city, this was likely the citadel where the garrison lived. In 2014, the debate was reignited by the discovery of the Kermsen disk, a small golden object bearing a Latin inscription that links Harald Bluetooth to Jomsborg. Some have speculated that this may have been brought to the location by Palnatoke and his men when they established their Baltic fortress. The disk was allegedly found in a hoard under a church near Volin, but was kept in a box of old buttons by a Swedish family for decades. If authentic, the disk at the very least proves a connection between the location and Norse royalty. However, the disk is controversial, with some scholars arguing it could be a forgery. By the 1040s, the era of independent Viking mercenary bands was coming to a close as Scandinavian kingdoms became centralized European states. According to some accounts, King Magnus the Good of Norway launched a campaign against Jomsborg in 1043, breaching the walls and burning the fortress to the ground. The destruction was total, and the survivors were scattered, marking the end of Jomsborg as a political entity. In the end, most historians now believe that the Jomsvikings existed, but not in the capacity that the sagas explained them. They were likely simply one of the most elite bands of Viking mercenaries, rather than the warrior monks of the Norse faith they're portrayed as in literature. They most likely represent the pinnacle of the Viking martial ideal, the ultimate professionals in an age of part-time soldiers. On the 24th of January, 41 AD, the Roman world shuddered and then held its breath. In the dimly lit corridors of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, the unimaginable had finally happened. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the emperor known to the troops and to history as Caligula, lay dead on the marble floor. He was a ruin of 30 sword wounds delivered by his own Praetorian Guard. For the first time since the rise of Augustus, the throne was empty. The beast was slain, and the tyranny was seemingly over. In that electric vacuum of power, the Roman Senate did something it hadn't dared to do in decades. It dreamed. The consuls, Sentius Saturninus and Pomponius Secundus, didn't flee, nor did they weep for the fallen ruler. Instead, they ordered the battalions of the urban cohorts to seize the forum. They convened the Senate not in the Julian Curia, a building that bore the hated name of the emperor's family, but in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. This was the sacred high-ground citadel of the ancient republic. There, amidst the smell of incense and the looming statues of the gods, they spoke of liberty. They debated erasing the memory of the Caesars entirely. They spoke of a world where the Senate would once again command the legions, and the magistrates would rule by law, not by whim. For a few delirious hours, it seemed that the clock had been turned back 70 years. The Republic was alive. But while the senators were getting drunk on their own rhetoric, the real city, the sprawling, brawling, hungry city of Rome, was making a different calculation. Down in the streets, the news of Caligula's death didn't bring cheers of liberation. It brought panic. The shops closed. The mob gathered in the forum, not to support the Senate, but to demand to know who would feed them. And in the Praetorian camp on the edge of the city, the soldiers weren't debating political theory. They were looting the palace, where they found Claudius, the trembling middle-aged uncle of the dead emperor, hiding behind a curtain. They didn't kill him. They hauled him out, hailed him as imperator, and declared he would now rule. By the next morning, the Senate's restoration had evaporated like mist. The consuls found themselves without an army, and the people were shouting for Claudius. The dream of the Republic died not with a bang, but with a vote of submission. The Senate formally conferred all imperial powers upon Claudius, confirming a harsh truth that would define the next 3 centuries. The Senate was a theater of dignity, but the emperor, and more than ever, elements of the military, were the reality of power. To understand why the Senate looked so powerful but felt so weak, we must return to the architect of the empire, Augustus. When Augustus emerged from the carnage as emperor, he faced a paradox. He had absolute power, won by the sword, but he knew that displaying naked power was a death sentence. Julius Caesar had acted like a king and died for it. Romans of all social classes were united under a single sincere foundational belief: Romans would never again be ruled by kings. Augustus was smarter. He realized that the Roman elite didn't necessarily need to rule, but they desperately needed to feel like they were ruling. Augustus created the Principate, a system of government that was essentially a monarchy masquerading as a republic. He famously claimed in his Res Gestae, his posthumous autobiography inscribed on bronze columns across the empire, that he had restored the republic. He handed the state back to the Senate and the people. He refused the title of dictator. He sat in the Senate House as merely the princeps senatus, or first man of the Senate, voting just like everyone else. It was a brilliant lie. By preserving the Senate, purifying its membership, and treating it with exaggerated respect, Augustus co-opted the aristocracy. He made the senatorial class accomplices in his regime. The Senate continued to meet, elect magistrates, and pass decrees which, over time, acquired the full force of law, replacing the cumbersome popular assemblies. To a casual observer, the dignity of the Roman state was intact. The genius of this system lay in the Roman legal distinction between potestas, meaning constitutional power, and auctoritas, meaning influence or moral authority. Augustus claimed he had no more potestas than his colleagues, but excelled everyone in auctoritas. For the Senate, the equation was inverted. In terms of legal power, the Senate was theoretically the source of all law, and it also governed peaceful provinces. The emperor held the maius imperium, or greater power, which allowed him to override any governor in any province. He held the tribunicia potestas, or tribunician power, which gave him the right to veto the Senate and protected his person as sacrosanct. The Senate could debate, but it could only decide what the emperor allowed it to decide. This created a psychological split within the Senate. Senators were trapped in a peerage of servitude. They were men of vast wealth and ancient lineage who had to pretend to be free, while knowing that a single frown from the princeps could end their careers or their lives. As Tacitus, himself a senator, bitterly observed, the nobility had been raised to wealth and high office by their propensity for servitude. We often assume that because the Senate stood for the Republic, the common people must have missed the Republic too. This is a modern projection. If you were a cobbler living in a third-floor apartment in the Subura, Rome's crowded working-class district in 20 AD, your reality was different. You had no memory of a free republic, and what you were likely told about was about chaos. The last century of the Republic had been a nightmare for the common people. It was a time when rival warlords like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar turned the streets of Rome into battlefields. It was a time of fire, famine, and gang violence. The Senate, in the eyes of the plebs, wasn't the guardian of liberty. It was the guardian of the optimates, the ultra-rich oligarchy that had consistently blocked land reform, opposed grain subsidies, and killed champions of their rights. When the Senate spoke of libertas, the people heard privilege. They heard the freedom of the rich to exploit the poor. The emperors, by contrast, positioned themselves as the heirs of the populares. They were the champions of the little guy. By taking the title of tribune of the plebs, the emperor signaled that he was the protector of the plebs against the predation of the ultra-rich senatorial class. The most critical factor in the common people's assessment of the Senate was food. Rome was a monster of a city, consuming 150,000 tons of grain a year. Under the Republic, the job of feeding the city fell to the aediles, young senators climbing the political ladder. They frequently failed. Grain prices fluctuated wildly, controlled by hoarding merchants and corrupt senators. Augustus changed the game. He took personal responsibility for the grain supply, the cura annii. Crucially, he took the management of this out of the hands of the Senate and gave it to a praefectus annii, a professional administrator from the equestrian class. This was a class of people below senators, often referred to in older sources as knights, that often engaged in more conventional businesses. The result was a stable, state-subsidized, and later free grain dole. To the common people, this was the primary justification for the empire. The Senate gave speeches, the emperor gave bread. This dynamic was brutally illustrated under Claudius. When a series of bad harvests caused a grain shortage, the mob didn't march on the Senate house. They found Claudius in the forum and pelted him with stale crusts of bread. They held him responsible because they knew he held the power. The Senate was irrelevant to the issue of survival. The shift from aediles to prefects was the single most important factor in breaking the bond between the Senate and the people. The Senate lost the power of the purse and the power of the pantry simultaneously. There was also a darker, more cynical reason the people preferred the emperor: entertainment, and not just gladiators. The common people enjoyed the spectacle of the Senate being humbled. For centuries, the senatorial class had strutted through Rome, demanding the right of way, flaunting their wealth, and treating the commoners with disdain. Now, the people watched as these same aristocrats were forced to bow and scrape before the emperor. Caligula, for all his madness, was often cheered by the mob because he humiliated the Senate. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot. He made scions of ancient families wait on his table. To the man in the street, this was a grim form of justice where the high and mighty were finally getting a taste of their own medicine. But if we want to know what the people thought, we can't just read modern histories derived from a study of ancient sources that were written by people from the senatorial class. We actually have the words of common people, written in their own hand without any filters. The graffiti of Pompeii and Herculaneum preserves the voice of the Roman street. The evidence suggests a profound lack of reverence. While official inscriptions praise the Senate and people of Rome, the graffiti is far more interested in gladiators, barmaids, and local gossip. When politics is mentioned, it's often cynical, saying something along the lines of, "Pickpockets support this candidate for the Senate." The charade that the Senate chose the emperor and held the ultimate legal authority came crashing down in 69 AD. This was a shambolic mess known to history as the Year of the Four Emperors. After Nero's untimely end, the empire collapsed into civil war. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian were all proclaimed emperor by their troops in the provinces, in Spain, on the Danube, on the Rhine, and in Judea. The Senate in Rome was reduced to a rubber stamp. When Galba approached Rome, the Senate declared him emperor and declared Nero a public enemy. When Otho slew Galba a few months later, the Senate declared Otho emperor and Galba a public enemy. When Vitellius defeated Otho, the Senate pivoted again. This is the moment that the fig leaf of senatorial control completely fell off, giving all Romans full view of how the sausage was really made. And yeah, as I'm recording this, I think I could have chosen a better mix of metaphors, but I'm going with it. Tacitus famously wrote that the secret of empire was revealed, that an emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome at the Senate. While this may not shock us modern people, this was a psychological earthquake to all Roman citizens outside the senatorial class, the elite of the elite. It stripped away the last pretense that the Senate was the source of legitimacy. The Senate didn't make emperors. Swords made emperors. The Senate merely ratified the survivor. When Vespasian finally came out on top, he didn't want to rely on the vague authority that Augustus had used. He wanted it in writing. The Senate passed the Lex de Imperio Vespasiani, a brutal piece of legislation that codified the emperor's powers. It explicitly stated that the emperor had the right to do whatever he deemed necessary for the state, just as Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius had done. It was the final legal surrender. The Senate formally voted that the emperor was above the law in perpetuity, a privilege that hadn't even been reserved for dictators in the Republican days. It was a capitulation that codified the autocracy, leaving the Senate with nothing but its social prestige. The Senate would continue to exist for centuries after, providing a gilded cage for these rare and ancient birds to squawk and tweet. The status of the Roman Senate in the early empire is a study in the difference between form and substance. Formally, it was the sovereign power of Rome, the partner of the princeps, and the maker of laws. Substantially, it was a terrified, reactive body that existed to rubber stamp the decisions of a military autocrat. Ironically, since the common people enjoyed seeing these wealthy, disconnected aristocrats shamed, it was important for early emperors to portray senators as powerful. After all, a quick humiliation ritual conducted on the senatorial class was a surefire way to win back support from the masses of people who weren't ultra-rich oligarchs. Imagine, if you can, the sound of the wind cutting across a Somerset hill in the late 5th century. There's a distinct mechanical hissing, a terrifying serpentine shriek that rises above the thrum of hooves. This isn't magic. It's military technology. It's the sound of a Draco, a Roman cavalry standard with a hollow metal head and a silken tail, designed to catch the wind and scream as the rider charges. The leader of these men was King Arthur, but not the Arthur of high medieval romance, not the king in shining plate armor, living in a stone castle with stained glass windows. We're looking for the man behind the ghost, the Romano-British war leader, who stood in the ruins of the Roman Empire and fought for his concept of his civilization. To find him, we have to strip away the magic swords and the round tables and look at the very real Roman evidence from the British Dark Ages. In 410 AD, the traditional narrative says the Emperor Honorius wrote to the cities of Britain, telling them to look to their own defenses. The legions had gone, stripped away by usurpers like Constantine III to fight civil wars on the continent. Britain was left adrift. But the lights didn't go out immediately. We know now that Dark Age Britain was a place of frantic adaptation. The local aristocracy tried to keep the Roman way of life going in the cities and surrounding areas. They maintained the roads, they spoke Latin, and they drank wine when they could get it. But the economy had collapsed. The coinage stopped arriving. The pottery industries failed. The world became smaller, darker, and more local. Into this vacuum came the wolves. That's what the British monk Gildas called them, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Initially, they might have come as mercenaries, foederati invited by British tyrants like Vortigern to fight the Picts. It's a classic story. You hire the barbarians to fight the barbarians, and then the hired help realizes you can't pay them, so they take the house instead. The Saxons brought a different language, a different religion, and a different way of war. In many places, Britons and Saxons lived side by side. Yet, politically, the island was fracturing. The East was turning Germanic and pagan, while the West remained British, Christian, and desperately Roman. And if political collapse wasn't enough, the weather turned against them. We have evidence of severe environmental stress in this period. There were droughts in the late 4th century, followed by a general cooling. Crops failed. Resources were scarce. Our best window into the 6th century is that monk named Gildas that I mentioned. Writing around 540 AD, right in the shadow of the supposed Arthurian age, he wrote a polemic called On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. Gildas wasn't writing history, he was writing a sermon. He wanted to scream at the British petty kings and chieftains of his day for their sins. He lists the disasters that befell Britain, including the Saxon invasion and revolt. He mentions a great victory for the Britons, the siege of Mons Badonicus. He tells us this battle stopped the Saxon advance for a generation. He tells us it happened in the year of his own birth. But he doesn't mention Arthur. Not once. Instead, he praises a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. He calls Ambrosius the last of the Romans. He says he was a man of high birth whose parents had worn the purple, implying imperial rank of some degree. To Gildas, Ambrosius is the savior, and according to some, this silence is damning. It potentially suggests that either Arthur didn't exist, or that Arthur is a later name given to the deeds of Ambrosius. Or still yet, it perhaps suggests Arthur was a general fighting under a king, and Gildas only cared about kings. Jump forward to the early 8th century. The Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon monk, writes his ecclesiastical history. He reads Gildas. He copies the bit about the battles. But again, no Arthur. To the Anglo-Saxons, this period was their heroic age of conquest. If there was a great British anti-king who slaughtered them by the thousands, they either didn't care to record his name, or perhaps they suppressed it. However, some believe that had such a heroic British king existed, they would have been very likely to publicize it. After all, the conquest of a powerful and mythic foe makes for a much better story than stomping out some disparate weaklings. The first potential name drop comes from a Welsh poem called Y Gododdin, which laments the death of warriors from the north. It talks about a great Welsh hero, and then mentions that, quote, he was no Arthur, implying that Arthur was already a very well-known heroic leader at this time. The only problem with this is what "at this time" means in the context, and the poem itself has been dated anywhere from the early 7th century to the late 11th century. If it came from the early 7th century, this poem is an absolute bombshell that potentially adds to the historicity of Arthur as a great Roman warrior against Anglo-Saxon rule. If it comes from the 11th century, it's a reference to a very well-known and well-established legendary figure. In the 9th century, a Welsh monk named Nennius compiled the Historia Brittonum, and this is where the legend explodes. Nennius gives us the first biography of Arthur as a military commander, and I'm using the term biography loosely here, since it's more of a brief collection of deeds. Nennius lists 12 battles that Arthur fought. He calls him Dux Bellorum, leader of battles, not Rex, meaning king. He says Arthur fought alongside the kings of the Britons, implying he was a supreme commander of a coalition. This lack of reference to him as a king, but serving with rulers, suggests that he was a man chosen on the basis of his merit and ability rather than on his bloodlines alone. The list is a logistical nightmare since many of the locations named don't correspond to any actual known locations. However, the locations that are known or likely known and the times between the battles imply that Arthur was active over decades and led a highly mobile fighting force. Historians can argue about texts all day, but the ground doesn't lie. In the last 50 years, archaeology has revolutionized our view of Arthur's Britain. We have found the places where the kings of this era lived, and they're spectacular in their own ways. They most certainly aren't the high medieval places we've heard about our whole lives, but they show a great degree of post-Roman sophistication. On the rugged coast of Cornwall lies Tintagel. For centuries, legend said this was where Arthur was conceived. Skeptics said it was just a remote monastery. They were wrong. Excavations in the 1990s and 2010s uncovered a massive quantity of imported pottery from the Mediterranean world. The lords here were drinking Byzantine wine and using olive oil, while the rest of Britain was sliding into subsistence. They were rich, powerful, and connected to the Roman world. Then, in 1998, they found the slate that would be dubbed by some the Arthur Stone. Scratched onto it were the Latin words, roughly translating to Artognu, father of a descendant of Call, made this. Some have argued that this may have been a real reference to Arthur, though other historians argue that Arthur more likely comes from the Roman name Artorius. Even still, it indicates that there was a ruler at Tintagel in the 5th or 6th century with a name that sounded extremely similar to Arthur. If Tintagel was the palace, South Cadbury was the fortress. Located in Somerset, it's a massive Iron Age hill fort. But in the late 5th century, the Arthurian moment, someone did something incredible. They refortified it. They built a massive new defensive wall using Roman-style construction techniques. This required enormous labor. It implies a centralized authority, someone who could command hundreds of workers. Inside, archaeologists found the post holes of a great hall. This was a feasting hall for a post-Roman warband. Strategically, South Cadbury is perfect. It sits near the intersection of major Roman roads. If you had a mobile cavalry army and you wanted to intercept Saxon raiders coming from the east, this is exactly where you would put your base. It fits the description of Camelot as a military headquarters better than any other site in Britain by a good margin. But of course that brings us to main contenders under the theory that he was a Roman or a Romano-Briton, and there's 3 main candidates. The first is Lucius Artorius Castus. This theory suggests Arthur was actually a Roman commander from the 2nd century, not the 5th. Lucius Artorius Castus was a real historical figure, a prefect of the 6th Victrix Legion, stationed in Britain around 180 AD. In 175 AD, Emperor Marcus Aurelius sent 5,500 Sarmatian heavy cavalry to Britain. These warriors worshipped a sword thrust into the earth and carried dragon standards. Proponents argue that Artorius commanded them, and his legend grew over centuries until he was moved forward in time to the Saxon Wars. It's a compelling story, but the timeline is the problem. It requires a 300-year gap where oral tradition preserved his name perfectly while forgetting when he lived. Most historians think it's a stretch, and honestly I do too, so let's move on. Riothamus is a fascinating figure. He was a quote-unquote king of the Britons in the late 5th century, exactly the right time. We know he existed because he received letters from Sidonius Apollinaris, a Roman bishop and aristocrat. Riothamus led a British army of 12,000 men across the Channel into Gaul to help the Romans fight the Visigoths. This matches the legends of Arthur's involvement in France. Even more striking is his end. He was betrayed by a Roman official named Arvandu. Defeated, Riothamus retreated toward the Burgundian town of Avalon, and he was never seen again. A betrayed king returning to Avalon to die sounds almost too perfect, and some think the Arthur legend may actually just be the story of Riothamus. But the most likely candidate is the one Gildas actually names, Ambrosius Aurelianus. He fits the profile perfectly. A Romanized aristocrat, a unifier, the victor of the anti-Saxon campaigns. However, his name clearly isn't Arthur, though there is a suggestion that it could have been a nickname derived from Arctos, the Greek word for bear. This, of course, is a highly speculative jump, and there's no actual evidence to support this. At present, the historical consensus leans strong in favor of King Arthur being a historical Romano-British leader, in a sense. Someone organized that defense. Someone rallied the war bands. Someone stood on a hill in Somerset and ordered assaults on the Anglo-Saxons. It's likely that he was an amalgam of multiple figures, with Ambrosius Aurelianus providing most of the real-life military prowess associated with the legendary king. In 1127, the people of Peterborough in England were shaken by a terrifying spectacle. It was said that a phantasmal hunting party rampaged through the woods repeatedly. These otherworldly huntsmen rode on black horses, and even black goats, accompanied by a pack of jet-black hounds with eyes like saucers. The spectral horde blew horns and shouted in the night, striking fear into all who heard them. This eerie scene is a classic example of the wild hunt, a ghostly chase that has haunted European folklore for millennia. The wild hunt is a widespread folklore motif involving a supernatural hunting party in furious pursuit, usually seen riding across the sky or through remote forests during stormy nights. The hunters are ghostly apparitions, often the souls of the dead or other supernatural beings like phantom warriors and demon dogs. Leading this unruly band is a wild huntsman, a mythic or ghostly figure whose identity varies by region. In Germanic lands, the leader was frequently identified as the god Odin or another pagan deity. Elsewhere, the huntsman might be a cursed legendary hero, a biblical villain such as Herod or Cain, or even the devil himself leading his legions. Regardless of the leader's name, the wild hunt's appearance is invariably fearsome. A clamoring cavalcade rushing by with black horses, spectral riders, and baying hounds. Encountering it was believed to be an exceedingly bad omen. Witnesses feared it heralded a looming war or plague, or at worst, their own imminent death. Many stories warn that anyone who crosses the wild hunt's path risks being swept up into the ride. The unlucky soul might be abducted to the land of the dead or, in Celtic regions, to fairy realms, never to return. Folklorists have traced wild hunt stories across northern, western, and central Europe and amongst Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic peoples. It's generally believed to originate from Germanic myths and legend, diffusing out from them to these other groups, though this isn't known with complete certainty. The concept is also found in areas that were once heavily influenced by these groups, including northern Italy, France, and Spain. The term wild hunt, known in German as wilde Jagd, was coined by the legendary folklorist Jacob Grimm in 1835. He had studied various folk tales of spectral hunters and hypothesized ancient pagan origins for the myth. Modern scholars debate the particulars of those origins, but the legend of the wild host on night rides struck a chord in many cultures. From Scandinavia to Spain, each region told its own version of the wild hunt, adapting the core motif to local characters and beliefs. Despite the varied geographical locations, every version of the wild hunt carries an aura of doom. In medieval times, a community that claimed to witness a spectral hunting party in the sky might fear that disaster was imminent. To see the wild hunt at all was to risk one's life or soul. Many stories tell of the hunters snatching up lone travelers, or anyone foolish enough to get in their way. More often than not, the wild hunt also served as a warning, often coming as a punishment for wrongdoing. Thus, the frightening myth reminded people to live rightly and humbly, lest they join that ghostly troop after death. Some folklorists and skeptics argue that reported wild hunt sightings could stem from natural atmospheric or environmental phenomena. One suggestion is that people witnessing powerful winter storms might interpret these as spectral riders, thunderous horses, and hellhounds racing across the skies. Historically, turbulent weather under dark winter skies would have been fertile ground for such misperceptions. Another hypothesis draws on psychological and social cultural factors. According to this view, collective anxiety could lead to shared hallucinations or group-reinforced legends. When combined with oral tradition and expectation, even ordinary sounds could be interpreted as evidence of these ghostly hunts. Still, another claim is that this represents a sighting of an aurora borealis, or reflects the distant and ancient cultural memories of sightings of them. Of course, the traditional view that these are actually rare ghostly riders in the sky continues to remain popular as well. You're sailing the desolate, ice-choked waters near Greenland in 1775 when, through the biting fog, a ship appears. She's weathered and weary, completely sheathed in thick spectral white ice, yet her tattered sails still hold the wind, propelling her on an endless journey. As you approach, you realize she's entirely silent, her deck barren. When your boarding party breaks below, they find the crew of 28, not missing, but perfectly preserved, locked in the macabre stillness of their final frozen moment. They've been dead for 13 years, but the ship hasn't stopped sailing. This is the legend of the ghost ship Octavius, a story where parsing truth from fiction is the only way to get at the true history that lies within this frozen floating tomb. And as a quick programming note, for this segment I'll first present the legend as it's usually told, and then discuss the problems with it after. The genesis of this catastrophe lay in a calculated gamble made years earlier. The Octavius, a three-masted schooner, had departed England in late 1761, intending to complete a standard lucrative merchant voyage to the Orient. The ship successfully reached China the following year, traded its goods, and loaded new exotic cargo for the return to British markets. It was at this crucial point when the captain, who is unnamed in most accounts, made the decision that sealed the fate of everyone aboard. The conventional route back required the arduous, time-consuming voyage around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. However, the captain noted unusually mild weather for the season and succumbed to the temptation of the legendary Northwest Passage. This shortcut, winding through the unforgiving Arctic Ocean above North America, had been the obsession of European explorers for centuries. In 1762, it remained an undiscovered and unproven delusion that had already claimed numerous ships and lives. Sailing through the Arctic ice fields was an astronomical risk, especially for a merchant vessel not specifically designed or equipped for polar exploration. The captain's choice represented a severe instance of hubris, prioritizing the distant dream of fame and a faster commercial return over the assured safety of his crew. The Octavius sailed north, attempting to round the northernmost tip of Alaska, near what is now Point Barrow. This was the last known position while the crew was alive. They entered the narrow, frigid straits, expecting glory, but instead found the crushing grip of the sea ice. The log's final entry confirmed the inevitable. By November 11th, 1762, the Octavius was irreversibly trapped. This marked the beginning of its 13-year drift across the top of the world. The crew and passengers, which included the captain's wife and young son, were lost to the Arctic labyrinth. The details of the discovery found by the Herald's boarding party are what cemented the Octavius as an enduring horror story. Below the silent, icy deck, the sailors found the entire complement of 28 individuals frozen in their cabins. The extreme cold had perfectly suspended the moment of their collective demise, creating an unsettling portrait of life instantaneously stopped. The most chilling scene, if you'll pardon the pun, was in the captain's quarters. According to the common accounts, the captain was found seated at his desk, pen poised in his frozen hand, a ghostly record keeper. Open before him lay the ship's logbook. Beside him were the bodies of his wife, as well as his young son, covered only by blankets. The mother had valiantly sacrificed every warm blanket she had in a vain effort to allow her son some quantum of comfort. Following this completely terrifying encounter, the Herald's crew promptly abandoned the Octavius. Carried by the winds and currents, the ice-laden ship disappeared into the night, never to be sighted again, thereby ensuring its permanent place in maritime lore as an unsolved mystery. But there's some problems with this story, starting with the legal context of the time, since British shipping was already highly regulated by the 18th century. When you consider the captain's fateful decision in the context of 18th century maritime law, his actions can be judged as a form of criminal negligence. A captain aboard a British merchant vessel possessed sweeping authority over his ship, crew, cargo, and route. However, this authority was intrinsically linked to a strict duty to the ship's owners and investors, who entrusted him with valuable commercial assets. The Merchant Seaman Act mandated formalized wage contracts and established the captain's obligation to maintain the agreed-upon route, largely to prevent desertion. After all, the men couldn't desert or even mutiny if they knew what they were getting into when they signed up for the trip. The Octavius captain's decision to pursue the Northwest Passage was a catastrophic deviation from his commercial mandate. He gambled the lives of 28 people and the immense value of the cargo on an unproven, highly dangerous exploratory route. By sailing into the Arctic, the captain created a massive hazard, which resulted in its total loss. But this begs the question as to whether a commercial captain could have ever convinced his crew to undertake such a dangerous mission. After all, sailors who signed up for official expeditions to find the Northwest Passage were compensated in accordance with their risk. These sailors weren't compensated for this, and would have likely refused any such order, given how absolutely insane it was. Simply put, in the 18th century, sailors would mutiny under these conditions, and any captain would have known this. This seems as good a time as any to segue into a discussion of whether this often repeated legend is fact or fiction. The central controversy in the Octavius legend lies in the nature of the key piece of physical evidence which doesn't exist: the logbook. The logbook in the 18th century world of seafaring was the official record of navigation, meteorological observations, and ship management. It was intended to provide documentary evidence for the ship's owners of every action undertaken by the captain and crew. However, the narrative of the Octavius's discovery includes a critical complication. When the Herald's boarding party seized the logbook, they found that the cold had deeply penetrated the paper. As they attempted to read beyond the open page which provided the last quote-unquote confirmed details, they accidentally destroyed the logbook. For researchers studying maritime disasters, logs and journals are vital for reconstructing the final movements and decisions of the crew. The lack of verifiable evidence and the inherent contradictions within the logbook narrative have led to a near-unanimous historical consensus. The Octavius is apocryphal folklore. The absence of primary sources confirming the story is telling, and no British ship undertook such a mission without insurance. The Lloyd's List, which maintained detailed shipping registers, hold no record of a vessel by that name, departing or disappearing in the 1760s. And just as a quick aside here, the Lloyd's List was first published in 1734 and is now on volume 63,000. Notably, the Herald, the ship that supposedly found the Octavius, also suffers the same issue. Despite being a whaling ship which would have required significant insurance and for which a paper trail would exist, the primary sources are again completely silent. Furthermore, the story's origins post-date the supposed 1775 discovery by decades, only appearing in print around 1828. Other stories circulated around the same time, essentially telling the same story, but with less details. Many speculate that the Octavius legend was simply a way to flesh out these stories, which were floating around newspapers. After all, adding a series of compelling details makes the story much more likely to sell than a bland narrative about a ship being found. What makes the Octavius stick with me is how it blends ambition, fear, and atmosphere into what effectively amounts to horror. Even knowing it's almost certainly folklore, the imagery is so strong you can't shake it. A ship drifting for over a decade with its crew frozen mid-task feels like the perfect metaphor for human overconfidence meeting the Arctic's absolute indifference. And maybe that's why the story hits so hard. It feels like something that could have happened, something that fits our psychology for both glory and shortcuts. It's eerie, tragic, and just grounded enough to feel uncomfortably real until you start scratching the surface. It's also further bolstered by the fact that the SS Bechimo is essentially the real 20th century version of this story, but that's a tale for another time. The year 1883 marked a pivotal, if initially unnoticed, moment in the history of near-Earth astronomy. Our stage is the recently established Zacatecas Astronomical Observatory in Mexico, situated atop La Bufa Hill. José Bonilla, a distinguished Mexican engineer and astronomer, had been elected the observatory's first director in 1882. On August 12, 1883, he was preparing for routine solar observations when his view was abruptly and repeatedly interrupted. Dark, elongated objects were streaking across the brilliant face of the sun, partially blocking its light. He immediately abandoned his planned work to dedicate his energy to documenting this stunning intrusion. This event, treated as a simple misclassification at the time, would likely turn out to be photographic evidence of how close our species came to being wiped out. Over the next 2 days, August 12th and 13th, he documented an astonishing total of 447 distinct dark silhouettes transiting the solar disk. It was an unrelenting, high-speed celestial flyover that suggested a phenomenon of massive yet unknown dimensions. The sheer volume and rapid movement of the objects demanded immediate attention. José Bonilla recognized the event's extraordinary nature and understood that capturing physical evidence was paramount. He performed a diligent, exhaustive observation over approximately 3.5 hours across the 2 days. During this time, he secured the primary evidence that would eventually unlock the likely mystery of what he'd seen. To capture this event, he relied on the challenging photographic methods available at the time. He employed the wet plate collodion process, a sophisticated technique for the 19th century that required a glass plate to be chemically coated, sensitized, exposed, and developed quickly. His diligence was exceptional, managing to capture 447 separate ink photographs during the 48-hour period the event lasted. Because the images were inherently low-quality reproductions due to the early technology, his accompanying written descriptions became essential for context. The scientist consistently described the objects as appearing fuzzy or misty, and critically noted that many of them possessed distinct dark tails. He published his observations without proposing a definitive cause in the prestigious French journal L'Astronomie in January 1886. This meticulous documentation preserved the raw data needed for future analysis. While the descriptions of fuzziness and tails might initially seem like artifacts of poor resolution, these traits would propose a solution to the mystery. The 19th century astronomical establishment struggled immensely to integrate this account into their understanding of the solar system. The response of the establishment wasn't to admit that it was an unknown, but to propose a solution that made no sense whatsoever. The sheer number of objects, combined with their rapid movement, defied easy categorization. The editor of L'Astronomie, when publishing the report, offered a tentative terrestrial solution. He suggested the phenomena might be nothing more than high-altitude flocks of migrating birds or large insects. This simple explanation aligned with the desire to attribute such anomalies to local, earthly causes. This, in essence, allowed the scientific establishment of the time to laugh off these observations, an act that would seem quite short-sighted in the long run. However, physical constraints quickly rendered the biological hypothesis impossible. José Bonilla noted that the objects crossed the face of the sun in a fraction of a second, often less than one full second. For any bird or insect to achieve such a speed, they would have had to be moving at velocities far beyond any known biological capability, even accounting for wind conditions. The ultimate flaw in the terrestrial explanation, and the key to the entire mystery, lay in a crucial piece of evidence. The objects were only visible from the Zacatecas Observatory. No other observatories, including those in nearby Mexico City, reported the solar transit. Had the objects been distant astronomical bodies, the transit would have been seen across a vast swath of the planet. To jump ahead a bit, their localized visibility is explained by the principle of parallax. A near object appears to shift relative to a distant background depending on the viewer's position. Since the background, the sun, was fixed, the objects had to be extremely close to the observing latitude. This constraint meant the objects were high-velocity bodies skimming the Earth, eliminating both slow-moving terrestrial life and distant celestial bodies. The absence of corroboration, initially used to dismiss the observations, became the strongest piece of physical evidence defining the object's trajectory. For decades following the publication, the Bonilla observation settled into an ambiguous corner of astronomical history. The data was meticulously recorded, yet inexplicable by the technology and theoretical framework of the time. This lack of resolution created a scientific vacuum, and the story of the unidentified objects persisted largely as a curiosity. In the mid-20th century, as popular interest in unidentified flying objects intensified globally, Bonilla's historical photographs gained a new life. The dark, fuzzy objects passing silently across the sun were enthusiastically claimed by some as the first photographic evidence of extraterrestrial visitors. While the narrative lacked scientific rigor, it served an important purpose by keeping the event in the public eye. And just to be clear, the reality of the observation was a lot more horrific than this. The definitive scientific breakthrough arrived in 2011, providing a powerful fact-based interpretation of the 19th century observations. A study provided a working hypothesis that the Mexican astronomer had witnessed the transit of fragments from a comet. This explanation elegantly synthesized all the observed data points in a way no other theory could. The object's appearance as fuzzy silhouettes with dark tails fits perfectly with the description of icy debris as the comet encounters orbital stress. Furthermore, the study quantified the scale of the debris field, finding that the size of the observed objects were consistent with cometary debris. The most consequential finding of the modern analysis involves the potential for catastrophe. The reevaluation revealed that the objects observed weren't just minor space dust. They represented the debris field of a gigantic parent comet. Researchers estimated the original mass of this body, prior to fragmentation, may have been equivalent to over 8 times the mass of Halley's Comet. This realization instantly elevated the observation to a record of one of the most significant planetary near misses in history. By calculating the energy each fragment carried, the researchers could model the impact scenario had the objects collided with Earth. Disturbingly, had it struck Earth, it would have had an impact energy of over 3,000 Tunguska events, which scientists believe would have caused a global extinction event. In the end, what José Bonilla documented wasn't the first photographic evidence of extraterrestrials, nor was it a flock of seagulls or some flying beetles. Instead, it was a terrifying record of our planet's survival by a matter of a couple hundred miles, an event that only one person on the planet noticed at the time. According to the Gospel of John, the seamless robe was a garment worn by Jesus during his crucifixion. The soldiers, recognizing its seamless construction was unnatural in a good way, chose not to divide it but cast lots to determine its owner. Over the millennia, various traditions have claimed possession of this relic, each with its own historical narrative and degree of authenticity. One of the most prominent claims originates from Trier, Germany. Legend suggests that Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine the Great, discovered the seamless robe during her pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the 4th century. She is believed to have sent the robe to Trier, where Constantine had previously resided. The first documented reference to the robe in Trier dates back to 1196, when Archbishop Johann I consecrated an altar containing the relic. Over time, sections of silk were added to the robe, and in the 19th century, it was treated with a rubber solution in an attempt to preserve it. These modifications have rendered the original fabric unsuitable for carbon dating, leaving its authenticity uncertain. The robe is typically kept folded in a reliquary and is rarely displayed. In 1512, during an imperial diet, Emperor Maximilian I requested to see the Holy Robe, leading to its public exhibition. This event initiated a tradition of pilgrimages, with the relic being displayed at irregular intervals, the most recent being in 2012. The periods between displays can be long, with some lasting as long as 150 years. So if you're really into the idea of seeing this version of the seamless robe, you better book your pilgrimage flight as soon as the next showing's announced. Another popular, though more dubious claim to the seamless robe is found in France. According to this tradition, Empress Irene of Byzantium gifted the robe to Charlemagne around the year 800. Charlemagne then entrusted it to his daughter, Theodora, who was the abbess of a convent in Argenteuil. The earliest known document referencing the robe in Argenteuil dates to 1156, authored by Archbishop Hugh of Rouen, who described it as the garment of the child Jesus. Over time, records began to change, and a legend developed around the relic that it was the seamless robe, an even more sacred relic than mere baby clothing. During the French Revolution, the parish priest cut the robe into pieces to protect it from desecration, with many pieces being lost. Not to be left out, the Eastern Orthodox Church also holds various traditions concerning the whereabouts of the seamless robe. In Georgian lore, a Jewish rabbi named Elias, present at the crucifixion, purchased the robe from the Roman soldier who won the bet for it and then subsequently brought it to Georgia. A portion of this garment is said to have been taken to Russia sometime in the 17th century. While historians and theologians remain skeptical of all claims to the seamless robe, the strongest relative claim appears to be that of the German robe. That said, like with all claims of religious artifacts, especially those directly associated with major league religious figures like Jesus, it may always be best to err on the side of caution.